there's a lot of work ongoing, as you know, to improve the digital publishing ecosystem. And the next two presentations will be about not two separate streams of work, but two very much interrelated streams of work. First, I will talk about the ePUB 3.1 revision, which is, how should I describe that? More of a short-term effort, meaning that it is a revision that is by design intended to not take many, many years to complete, but rather be quite quick. And then, following on that short-term presentation, we will talk about the longer term with Ivan and the collaboration between IDPF and the W3C. All right. So the ePUB 3.0 revision has been ongoing now for soon, well, in the late summer it will be about a year. But in fact, we spent 1.5 years or so before that preparing for the revision, trying different methods of understanding what the pain points are, what the most missing features are in ePUB, and where we should be going in the short term to make life better for all stakeholders. As the charter of the working group was published, there were these 5 pillars or main topics or main themes of the revision that we were chartered as a working group by the IDPF board to work on. The first one is consolidation. So IDPF has been working on what we call modular specifications for many, many years now, when we develop features separate from the main specification and then potentially incorporate them into the main specification if they prove to have enough value and market adoption. So for example, fixed layout ePUBs is a phenomenon for which you may have varying opinions on whether it's a good idea or not. I certainly have. I won't share them with you. But it was developed in that way, as a separate module and then eventually incorporated. Now, we've done other stuff. I'll be talking a little bit more about them later. And for this revision, the question would be, which of these should be incorporated into the main core ePUB spec? Second, simplification. May mean many things, but simplification for authors that are trying to do ePUB books, simplification for implementers who are trying to get their code to work, whether they're doing authoring tools or reading systems or anything in between. The directive here is to try to simplify the ePUB specification to simply make it more streamlined. Third, clarify scripting and interactivity. So this is a really troublesome area for a number of reasons. First, and as all of you who are publishing ebooks know, the support for scripting and interactivity in reading system varies a lot. From not supporting anything at all to supporting basically everything that you can do on the web today and everything in between there. And the reason why this is problematic is that there's multiple reasons for this being the case. One reason is heritage. So, as you probably also know, there are many ePUB reading systems out there which were basically built during and for the ePUB 2 era, in which there was no scripting support at all. And many users out there still have these hardware devices that they bought 4 or 5 years ago. They might be very difficult to update or impossible to update, and they expect them to continue working, right? The second main reason why it's troublesome is security and privacy. So I won't go into details about that, but it's the whole problem area of assuring that some service provider does not ingest ePUB content that violates security and tries to do something illegal. Similarly, privacy, how do we assure in this distributed model between content and consumption that you as a user are not being spied upon by somebody you don't want to spy upon you. Fourth, and this is where Ivan and his friends at the W3C come in, open web platform alignment. So as has been said many times today already, starting with Bill McCoy this morning, IDPF is on a vector of aligning more and more with the open web platform. What we did in this revision was, or what we're still doing, I should say, is to work on trying to make sure that we take whatever steps we can in that direction now. Even though our time frame and scope is limited, there should be things that we should be able to do to start or continue the acceleration of full open web platform alignment. And finally, new features. So I said earlier that we actually prepared the revision for a long time before starting it. Much of that work was about trying to understand the needs of the membership. We did surveys, we did open webinars, and so on in order to gather information. And we basically had the membership propose to us in an open way everything they would like to see happen. So we have a big list of stuff that we could potentially do. Okay, so with those 5 pillars, high-level directives in mind, let me give you a few examples of the things we've been working on. And before I do that, let me also say that we already have a first editor's draft of ePUB 3.1 available since January. There's a link here at the end of my presentation. And you can also Google ePUB 3.1 editor's draft, and you'll be taken there. Some of the things I'll mention are already in there, and others are still being worked on. So an editor's draft is just an unofficial snapshot, right? It's not formally endorsed by IDPF in any way. It's just a way of publishing stuff to get comments. Oh yes, this one. I put it first because it's probably one of the more tricky situations we've been in. HTML serialization. So ePUB, since its onset, has used XML as its base syntax for expressing everything. This includes the content documents which are in the HTML language. This is a language which supports 2 serializations, the XML serialization, which ePUB uses, and the HTML serialization, which everybody else uses, right? So the observation is simple. We have nothing to gain in the long term from staying on to a specific serialization of our content documents. It just brings us bad luck, right? Fewer tools that can do what we want, and so on. So the question isn't, should we do the move? The question is, when, right? We have had a lot of input since we published the editor's draft in January, which makes this change to allow HTML. We've had a lot of input. Some people have applauded our bravery. Others have told us what would happen to their infrastructure inside their companies and between companies and at the consumption stage if we did this now. So it is a tricky, very, very tricky one. CSS, we have a talented group of people helping us with CSS, including Dave Kramer from Hachette, who's taken us through an update of our support for CSS. I won't go into all the details of individual features that we're adding or removing, but there are a couple of highlights that could be mentioned. ePUB 3 and 2 had profiles of CSS, subsets of CSS that reading systems had to support, or should support. The reason for this is historical. ePUB 2 reading systems weren't expected to be based on browsers, but they were actually custom apps that just used small subsets of both HTML and CSS. But now we're moving away from that profile thing in a twofold manner. First of all, instead of maintaining a profile, we just now point to the W3C so-called CSS snapshot, which is the W3C's definition of what out of the hundreds or so CSS modules that there are actually work, right? So they're doing all the hard work of tracking what browsers support, and we just point to that. Second, and this may come as a surprise to you, CSS support is now required for visual reading systems. It hasn't been before for these historical reasons that I mentioned. So with this, we hope to clarify the general expectation of an ePUB reading system that it actually is supposed to behave as a browser does when it renders things visually. Metadata, another lovely topic. One of the things we heard over the years is that publishers and solution providers aren't really interested in having metadata inside ePUB. It always lives outside somewhere, and it's a living organism that changes over time, right? So why should we bother putting a lot of metadata into the ePUB if we're only duplicating stuff, the real stuff that lives outside? We've done a few changes that to help enable those publishing and consumption workflows that's based on this external idea. So you can now, actually you could in ePUB 3 as well, but now we're really embracing the approach of just linking from the ePUB to the external record and establishing that association. Reading systems will not be required to go and fetch that metadata because obviously if you're offline or if it's some strange metadata record type that you don't know about, you can't fetch it. So we still keep the minimally required metadata inside the OPF. What we proposed in the January draft was also a radical reduction of what you can do in the OPF inside the ePUB to minimize the confusion that occurs of what actually is a real bibliographic record, right? The metadata inside an ePUB does not have the ambition of being a real complete bibliographic record. So we try to reduce what you could say in there to just hammer that point in. In the spirit of simplification and open web platform alignment, we've also taken a hard look at what we can remove from ePUB without causing any harm. So when we align with the open web platform, what that means practically is that any feature that we use in digital publishing should be a native feature of the open web platform. And ePUB has superstructures, right? Things that HTML and CSS doesn't do that we want to do, that we built on top of it. And some of those superstructures have staying power. We know that as we work on alignment, the W3C will have to adopt these constructs in some way or other to enable digital publishing natively. Other features maybe don't have staying power, and that's what we looked at here. What can we remove that are basically things that aren't used that much or that has a much better replacement these days? And yeah, it's a long list. The NCX is the ePUB 2 navigation layer. It was allowed in ePUB 3 for backwards compatibility purposes, but we had a better replacement for it, which is an HTML-based navigation document. Guide element, similar. I won't go into details about all of these. The linear attribute, switches and triggers in content, and so on. Lots of stuff. You can, if you're interested in the details, there's a link at the end of the presentation to the changes document where we talk about these in detail. So shaving off features which we don't believe have a part of the future is the exercise here, essentially. In the spirit of simplification, we've tried to reorganize the documents that make up the ePUB 3 specification. We've haven't received a lot of input. Those that have reviewed it say that they think it's better, but I'm not thinking that we found the sweet spot yet in terms of making the spec better. There's some work remaining. But yes, that's also a substantial piece of work. Yes, you may have heard the term BFF. It either means best friends forever, or it means a browser-friendly format. Again, kudos to Dave Kramer for his fantastic sense of humor. This is an alternate way of providing an ePUB on the web, right? So we know that there are cloud readers that read ePUBs today. We also know that it is quite a lot of work to get an ePUB onto the web and read easily by browser technologies. There's the zip archive, there's lots of XML structures and stuff that aren't really native to the web platform. So what the attempt is here in BFF is to create an alternate way to present an ePUB, which is not zipped in a zip archive, but that lives on a server, which much more easily can be consumed by a browser with some JavaScript code. And which actually is also lifting the same origin constraint, if you want to call that. In an ePUB, all resources are together. In BFF, they wouldn't necessarily have to be, so you can link to resources anywhere on the web. Yes. Accessibility. So Daniel and Alex have already talked about this. I won't go into much more detail than Daniel did. But anyway, as Daniel pointed out, ePUB holds a lot of promise for accessibility. If you're a publisher with a reasonably good authoring tool, you don't actually have to be an accessibility expert to produce a book that will be reasonably accessible, at least a magnitude better than other portable document formats out there today. If you really know what you're doing, if you're an accessibility expert, you can use ePUB to create something that is better than humanity has ever seen in terms of portable documents, right? So that's the promise. Problems still exist, for example. One of them is discoverability. So users, imagine you're a student, a disabled student, for example, at university, with a huge digital library in front of you. How do you identify which of these titles that you can read, that you can consume? There's no mechanism to discover things that work for you. For authors, there are problems. The techniques that we use to solve particular issues with accessibility are unclear or even non-existing in some cases. For example, how do I do accessible mathematics? Is it true that all I have to do is use MathML? Well, I'm sorry, but it's actually not true. If I have an external description of a complex graph or a diagram that lives somewhere else, how do I link the two up? It is not clear, right? So techniques are missing. And third, for those publishers that do take the extra effort to create fully or at least reasonably accessible publications, how do you prove that? How do you stamp them with metadata to enable the users to find them? One of the things we've worked on is new properties for schema.org, access mode and access mode sufficient, which are intended to help the declaring of the accessibility state of a book on the one hand, and the user's ability to discover and match his or her preferences against the book. That work is ongoing. And the other thing that Daniel also mentioned then is the ePUB accessibility specification, which is a separate document not tied to ePUB 3.1, but intended to be applicable to any version of ePUB, even ePUB 2. We're building on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines of W3C here. And we are intending to provide an entire framework to enable the inclusive publishing paradigm to come to fruition. So a techniques document, just like WCAG has, inheriting, of course, all the work that the W3C has done, but extending it for ebook-specific techniques. And we have also, in part of building this framework, we will also provide an accessibility checking tool. So the DAISY consortium, which both Daniel and I work for, has received a Google Impact Challenge grant that enabled us for 3 years to work on a tool that implements these specifications to enable publishers and others to actually test their books for accessibility. Yes, so I don't remember, Daniel, if you went through this, but WCAG has 4 main principles of accessibility: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. These all apply to our ecosystem as well. What we introduce is a 5th one, which is discovery or discoverable, which ties into the problems I mentioned, right? How do you match a user's preferences against a set of properties in a publication? We're embracing the universal accessibility principles that WCAG builds on, but we also recognize the fact that digital publications can be optimized for a specific user group. Braille books are an example, talking books are an example, books for the hard of hearing are actually an example as well, although we don't always talk about them a lot in comparison to other print abilities, but it certainly is in scope here. And yes, so this document is available already. It was not referenced from the first editor's draft, but it is now on this address, idpf.org/epub/A11y. It's also an editor's draft, and it's currently being reviewed by the core working group for WCAG at the W3C as well. So, okay. I'm not sure how I'm doing with time, but I'll barge forward. What happened since the first working draft came out? First, let's look at some of the directives in our charter. First of all, in terms of trying to improve the ePUB specification in terms of features and simplicity and alignment, we have some restrictions, of course. First of all, the working group is obliged to reject, defer, or separate any feature that shows signs of being immature or too complicated or having rights issues, etc., related with it. And second, we have a compatibility constraint. 3.1 is not supposed to be the new shiny knight in armor that does things totally different in a much more sexy way, but it needs to work as much as possible, ideally 100% with existing implementations. So our directive is that non-backwards compatible features should be added only in extraordinary cases, if there's extensive stakeholder backing for it and extraordinarily good motivation. So the January draft was intentionally aggressive. We did this in a way to provoke reaction. I think any consortium, any gathering of institutions and organizations that work together have the problem that some of those organizations are more loud-voiced than others, right? So IDPF has 300 members. 20 or 30 of those companies, organizations participate regularly. We hear their voices loud and clear. 300 minus 30, yeah, you can do the math. We don't hear a lot from, right? And what we wanted to do here was to make sure that we heard from more people than usual. So the aggressive draft of January was a way to provoke people to come out from whatever stones they were hiding under and tell us. And to some extent, I think we succeeded. We've heard from companies, individuals, institutions that we haven't heard from in a long time during the past 2 months. So it's been fun, even if some of those we heard from sounded a bit angry at times. We were able to calm them down, because the idea is now to actually start making a realistic version of ePUB 3.1 based on the information we've received from the ecosystem. So, for example, with metadata, our reduction of what you can do in OPF was one of the most hated change proposals. We have to bring that back again, the way it's looked in ePUB 2 and ePUB 3. There is a particular attribute called refines, which we still hope to, eventually get rid of, but we have to bring that back as well. The NCX, similarly, the ePUB 2 and DAISY navigation structure cannot be completely removed, because there are still big parts out there of the ecosystem that relies on ePUB 2 compatibility. So we're bringing that back. Some of the feature shaving that we did, however, we hope to actually be able to retain and have them completely removed, so they're not allowed anymore in terms of simplification then and alignment. The switch elements, for example, being one of them. The browser-friendly manifestation, the alternate manifestation of ePUB, will continue to be an IDPF project, but it will be detached from the 3.1 cycle, because we've realized that we need a lot more time and a lot more implementation experience in order to make sure that we get it right. And this also ties into, what Ivan will be talking about next. We also have a situation here where work on longer-term evolutions is ongoing at the same time, and we want to make sure that the browser-friendly manifestation is well aligned with the work we're doing at W3C. So BFF will not be a part of 3.1, but we will definitely continue to work on it. Similarly, HTML, and this isn't formally decided yet, but we're leaning towards actually waiting with introducing HTML support. Again, nobody's saying that we won't ever need to do it. We realize that we have to, because it's the only thing that makes sense. But our challenge is to find the right point in time of doing so. And we've had indications that 3.1 is a tad too early. It might be better to wait until we start with ePUB 4. Oh, yes, and consolidation. So we've also decided to not integrate any of the recent modular specifications, multiple rendition, region-based navigation, which is used for comics, dictionaries and glossaries and indexes. All of these specifications are not integrated, for the simple reasons that we do not yet have enough implementation experience, as Daniel Weck mentioned as well. So these remain available for anybody who wants to start using them and implementing them. But they are not part of ePUB 3.1, and therefore there are no conformance requirements for reading systems to support these yet. 3 open issues, and I think I'm almost done now if you're getting eager, Ivan, to get started. CSS defaults. So for those of you who are publishing ebooks, you know that one of the most costly and time-consuming parts of that process is to make sure that the content looks good, or at least reasonably good, on all the different reading systems out there. It's an extremely time-consuming process and extremely annoying to everybody who's involved in that work. So the question is there something we can do to help alleviate the situation and make things a little bit more like they are on the web, right? There are much fewer browsers than there are reading systems, which makes their world simpler. But the browsers, with some small deviations, more or less do a good job in displaying things the same way, right? It's a much smaller problem on the web than it is for us in ePUB, and we want to close that gap. So what could we do? The discussions are still ongoing. We talked about it at the face-to-face yesterday as well. Can we, for example, get reading systems to honor a default style sheet at the very basic level of styling? Can we allow authors to express with metadata the intent of what we call leave me alone, LMA, which simply means, it's a way of saying, I as an author know what I'm doing with CSS. You shouldn't fiddle with my margins and my line heights as a reading system. And note, we're not talking about users here. Of course, users must always be able to customize the presentation for their purposes. What we're talking about is the so-called middleman, right? The reading system that sits between the publisher's styling and the user's styling. Yes, so that's a topic that we hope to have at least some progress on in 3.1, but we're not sure yet. Second, external resources. So, for example, when it comes to fonts or media files with prohibitively large file sizes, and when it comes to data, for example, in educational contexts where you need to fetch data and render, there's a lot of good things to say about being able to have these external to the ePUB package. And that's something that we also hope to do some progress on. And third and finally then, we're still hoping to be able to introduce a new audio format. We don't know how this will go because there are some quirks. But for those of us who publish speech in ePUB, such as you could do in DAISY, with a full integrated synchronized text and speech experience, having a speech optimized audio format will be a big benefit. Smaller file size and better audio quality. There is a completely open, non-proprietary format called Opus, which has been developed by IDPF and is an integral part of the W3C WebRTC spec, which would be perfect. It's already supported as well in a majority of browsers, although not all of them. So, for example, not supported in WebKit yet, which is the major hurdle here. We don't know what's going to happen. And if we bring on this audio format and it's not supported in all the browsers, it's going to create a lot of headaches for reading system implementers. So anyway, those are three. Of course, we have many more issues, but those are three. Yes, this is the last slide. Now I promise, Ivan, this is the last one. So the first editor's draft was out in January. It's still there. We will publish a second one now in April, still an editor's draft, which means informal, just for review. Our charter says that our specification development should end by October, November of this year. We may request an extension. We will see what happens, because we've had additional asks from the board in the meantime, so we may need more time. And this will be followed by an implementation and conformance testing time period, whose end date is unknown, which is the nature of that phase of development. But the spec development end, meaning when the working group will cease to work on the spec, is by the end of this year. And after that, our focus will be on conformance and implementation. And yeah, I think that's it. Again, lots of links here in the slides that you can access afterwards. Thank you.